Engineering London and Cloud Platform Engineering Leaders, the first ever online event that we're running. We're here today with three exceptional speakers, Ben Pearce, David Sandilands, and Jacob from RIG. We've got three amazing talks, but before we get started, as per usual, I've just got a few things to run through on the deck. So for those who don't know us, we're CommunityStack, and we're on a mission to build the next generation of social infrastructure. So this is a bit more about us. Essentially, we're a portfolio operator of different technical communities. We've currently got 18 under our portfolio, which is exceptional. And we do everything from data and AI to cloud, AWS, Azure, GCP. We've got a full suite. We've got 18 communities, 8 conferences, and 25,000 members. And we also build platforms related to community work, and then we kind of do other work within the third sector as well. The team for the past 11 months have been working diligently on our community switchboard platform. So a national accessibility discovery platform for third sector, so charities, community groups, volunteering organizations. Essentially, you can create a community in under 10 minutes. Create a website in under 10 minutes, which is fantastic, completely free. And it's kind of advertised and work for non-technical people as well, which is awesome. And then within that, there's stuff around pathways to work initiatives, particularly for 16 to 24-year-olds, and then other work, including community events, etc. within that as well. So CommunityStack has got 6 elements. So ecosystem, which is all of our communities. So engine is our initial kind of work around community governance and verification. And this will also turn into our full-blown kind of competitor to Meetup, Bevy, Luma, etc., launching on September 7th this year. We've got Switchboard, which I mentioned earlier, which is all around charities in the third sector. Intelligence, which is taking kind of the data between all those 3 products and then kind of enabling organizations to have better data-drivens who operate within that area. Then enterprise as well. We're creating an internal community platform based off of Engine for enterprise organizations, which will launch to kind of the back end towards this year. And then we've got Labs, which is headed up by my amazing co-founder, Mercedes Moxon-Greenfield, who I'll talk a little bit later on about. So we basically take different challenges within the community and different areas, and we try and tackle them. So we've got work around SEND reform. So special educational needs is a big topic at the moment in the UK. So we're building a SEND chatbot later this year, which is awesome. As part of Community Switchboard, we're launching something called No Community Left Offline, which is our campaign to showcase true rural digital inclusion. And then also something quite near and dear to my heart, we're building an open AAC product, so an alternative communication device, particularly aimed at those with young children with neurodivergency, which is awesome. But yeah, we've also got some other future plans within that as well. So majority of will probably know me because I'm quite active on LinkedIn, but I'm the co-founder and CEO. I launched CommunityStack just almost a year ago now, so it's been pretty cool, but I've been running technical communities for around 6 years ago. As I mentioned, I run CommunityStack with my amazing co-founder, Mercedes. She's a former UK robotics champion. We're both very passionate about accessibilities, communities, etc. So we're doing a lot of work with this area. We've also got a very small team of 7 people. In everything from kind of policy to legal. So we're growing quite rapidly. We're doing some awesome stuff. But yeah, we're very proud of the work that we do. And there's a lot more stuff to come, which is awesome. But if you know any charities who want to be involved with Community Switchboard, it's completely free. They get a fully accessible website. It's a full discoverability platform. It's launching next Wednesday on April 29th. We've got some awesome plans around that. So yeah, if you're interested, please drop myself a line. In terms of conferences as well, we've also got some awesome stuff in the works. We're running 8 conferences this year. Over the next 12 weeks, we're doing 25 events, both in person and online. So it's keeping myself and the team very busy. You can scan this QR code here, which will take you to our meetup page. We've got some, our meetup program is going live towards the back end of this weekend. So it may look a bit bare in certain elements just yet, but we're always on the lookout for speakers, sponsors and hosts, particularly in London as well. And we're actually fully booked now for our Yorkshire communities until the end of the year, which is awesome to see. So these user groups and meetups would not be possible without our amazing sponsors. We'd firstly like to thank Overmind. They've been a long-term sponsor of CommunityStack. The CEO, Dylan Radcliffe, is an awesome individual. And they're doing some incredible stuff within change and security management. You can scan this QR code here, which takes them to their website. But they're very supportive. And Dylan did a fantastic talk at our last in-person event in London with Lloyds Banking Group, which was awesome. And then next up, we've got Netmind AI. So I'd like to invite Demi to say a few words.
Hello, can you hear me? Hi.
Yep.
Okay. Hi everyone, this is Demi from the marketing team at Langr AI. Super excited to be here today. I'm going to take 2 minutes to introduce you to something we have been really passionate about, Agent Arena. So let's dive in. Agent Arena is an open ecosystem where AI agents can interact, communicate, and compete in real challenges. The idea is simple. We want to know how do agents think and react and perform. So when real rewards are on the line. Because honestly, there are still so many unknown about how agents will evolve. Arena is like live in lab. Every competition reveals what agents can truly do. So we put in over 10,000 USDC to find out where agents compete for real money. Can they earn, create value, and win? So let me walk you through what's actually happening on Arena 42. First up is daily USDC prediction competitions. It's like Polymarket, but for agents. Every day, your agent predicts real-world events like finance, sports, politics, and earn real USDC payouts. It's already live and already paying out. Just head to our website and you are in. And another two thing we just launched is called APPI, the Agent Personality Taste. Think like Myers-Briggs, but for AI. This one is just really fun. Ever wonder what kind of personality your agent actually has? Just go check it out. And our biggest one yet, the 5,000 USDC bounty. It's a competition to design the best competition on Arena and win up to 5,000 USDC and keep 95% of all revenue your competition generates. And so the better your competition, the more you earn. That's a quick look at what's happening on Arena, and new competition dropping every day. Just go explore for yourself at arena42.ai. And whether you are an agent builder or just AI curious, come join Arena 42. Bring your agent, create, compete, and earn. We want to find out together. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you, everyone.
No worries. Thank you very much. I had the pleasure of seeing a demo of this in action back in February when they were first launching it, and it is pretty cool to see how it all works. But Netmind AI, are hosting our next event on April 30th. Oh, sorry, on the 7th of May. Apologies. In London for our cloud native and Gen AI communities, which is awesome. And we've got 2 speakers planned, including one chap who's flying in for the session. I won't reveal his name just yet, but you'll be able to see it on LinkedIn later on. Cool. So. Just one last thing from me. We just want to say thank you very much for coming out this evening. We have got 202 people registered for this event, which is awesome to see online. It's fantastic to see the amount of response we're getting for online events. So all of our talks, including the 3 here tonight, will be available on our YouTube channel, and they'll be loaded later in the week, but there's a backlog of 50 on there to keep you occupied in the meantime. As I said, if you've got any questions or any thoughts, please get in touch with myself. So. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Ben Pearce to the stage. So let me add you on here, Ben. Perfect. We're all ready to go?
Brilliant. Yeah. So I'm all live, ready to go. Well, thank you so much for inviting me along, Ethan. And thank you, everybody, for coming along to this session this evening, which I hope is going to be a really interesting session. There's some great variety. Now, for those of you that don't know me, which is probably most people, my name is Ben Pearce. My background is I spent 20 years at Microsoft, about 10 of those years as a deep technical customer-facing engineer. And then about 10 of those years in leadership roles, so leading customer teams, customer engineering teams, technical sales teams, things like that. And then about 3 years ago, I started Elevated You, which is my own company. And what I focus on is developing the human skills. So like the leadership skills, the communication skills of people in the tech world. And that's what I do all the time. And so what I'm going to cover for the next few minutes is how to communicate with impact to your stakeholders. And I'm also assuming that a lot of people on the call today are either going to be leaders that have direct reports reporting into them, or that are thought leaders, that are perhaps making decisions and helping drive teams, even if they haven't got direct management responsibility. So I'm hopefully going to help folks today with their own communication. And so if you're talking to your very senior leaders, execs, customers, this will help. And if you're coaching teams, this will help you coach your teams. So that's what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes. I want to start off with this slide. So if I think about high performance skills and what are the sorts of skills that people that are really thriving in tech at the moment, where are they? Well, if I look at it historically, my daughter's just started watching that cult classic, The IT Show. The IT Crowd. And I was watching it with her yesterday. This might be, if you were to take tech, human skills and AI skills, where you might put people from the IT crowd, right? In the past, I think there was a lot of room for people with great tech skills. Perhaps AI wasn't around yet, but perhaps didn't have great human skills. So great communication, great leadership skills. If you were to look at perhaps some of the AI hypers, they would tell you only need AI skills. And as long as you've got AI skills, you don't need anything else. But I put it to you that actually the people that are really thriving and will thrive going forward are the people that have got that great blend of tech skills, great AI skills, and great human skills. So they're able to understand the architecture, the context in which they're working. They are able to outsource more and more of that tech heavy lifting that before we needed to be able to do. And that's where AI is really helping us. So they've got that great tech architecture view, great context, great AI doing their tech heavy lifting, but then are able to take that to customers, able to take that to senior leaders and to put insight and to communicate effectively. So I think as more and more of the tech heavy lifting goes to AI, human skills, communication skills, being able to work well with other humans becomes even more important. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is do two things with you. The first thing is to give you a framework that you could take away and start using tomorrow to help you plan for your next stakeholder meeting, your next presentation or your next meeting, that you could take away and use, or that you could take away and coach your team to do better if you think your team need to get better at that. So that's the first thing I'm going to do for the first half. And the second half is I'm going to take one particular facet of that, which is how you tell stories, how you bring stuff to life with examples, case studies, things that have gone wrong, and how you tell stories and why it's important to tell stories. So those are the two things that I'm going to cover over the next 20 minutes. Let's start off with this framework that I want to talk about. Now, Ethan has heard me talk about this before. I don't stop banging on about it, in fact. But the reason for that is because it's really important. This is the framework that I think is really important. It's the Auran framework. And Auran is a mnemonic, and it stands for this: audience, objective, remembered, emotion, next steps. So what this is when you are planning for an important meeting, when you are planning for a presentation, perhaps something like this, you're speaking at a community event, this is what you think about and complete before you even think about the demo you're going to give, before you even think about the architectural diagrams you might use, before you even think about the slide deck, before you even think about the stories that you're going to tell. You do this first. And what it means is that it will help you create a much better and more impactful presentation. So I used it for this today, and I use it all the time. So what I'm going to do for the first 10 minutes is just unpack each of those, talk about what I mean about each of those. So let's start with audience. So when I'm preparing for a presentation, first thing I think about is who's going to be in the audience. A lot of people, when they're presenting, think that, well, this is my presentation, right? It's about me. It's about my objectives, what I want to say. It's all about me, me, me. And I put it to you, that is exactly the wrong mindset. The mindset you want to be in is, how do I give value to the audience? How do I give value to the audience? And if you can get into that mindset, then actually the things that you'll say will be far more impactful, and therefore you're more likely to be successful. So the audience is the center whenever you start thinking about these presentations. Now, if the audience is the center, you need to know your audience. Who's going to be in there? Are you talking to leaders? Are you talking to graduates? Are you talking to deeply technical people? Are you talking to business people? Get to know your audience. Try and understand what's the pain they're facing. What's the opportunity that's before them, right? So get to know and see if you can take the perspective of the people that you're going to be talking to. Because if you can take their perspective, then you can be relevant to them. This is what we often get wrong in tech. We talk about the things we know, not about the things the audience need to hear. But you can be relevant to your audience if you know your audience. And if you're relevant, that's when you give value. And if you give value, that's when people choose your solution. They take your ideas on board. They choose your product, whatever it might be. But that's, if you can be valuable to your audience, that's how you become successful. So the first thing I do, I grab my notebook, I jot down audience, and I just write down who's going to be in the audience, what personas or what people, if I know what people. Then I think about the objective. Now, I think about the objective in two ways. Firstly, the audience objective, and this is what a lot of people don't do. So what do I mean by the audience objective? Well, if you imagine you were sitting down to listen to me tonight, maybe, probably sitting down to listen to the other speakers, but imagine you were listening down to listen to me and you're going, I can't wait until Ben talks about this thing. What's this thing that is really important to me? Well, see if you can empathize with your audience and think about what the objective of your audience is to listening to you, and jot it down. And then see if you can get clarity on what your objective is. What are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to convince a senior stakeholder that your solution is the best one and you should fund getting these products so that you can deploy this solution? Whatever it might be for you, but just get clarity. What is your objective? And use empathy and perspective taking as best as you can on what the objective of the audience is, and jot that down. So those are the first two things I do. Next thing I do, what do I want the audience to remember? An audience, let's just take tonight, right? We've got 3 speakers, hour and a half, loads of different topics. The amount of information you're going to get is going to be tremendous. So my job as a speaker is to hopefully try and get you to remember some of it, because it's valuable, right? And I want you to be able to recall it, and I want you to feel empowered to use it. So I need to have clarity on what I want you to remember. Because if I don't have clarity on what I want you to remember, there's no chance that you're going to remember it. So the first thing is, think about, what do you want your audience to remember from your session that you're giving? First thing is the key message. So if you were going to say in one sentence what the key message was, what is it? And see if you can write that down. So for this session today, it's for me saying that I think that your communication skills are super important to your career success and your team's success. And I've got a couple of techniques that help you. That's my key message. Now, then you want a few sub-themes that are going to support that key message, right? No more than 5 sub-themes. It's not 11. It's not 17. It's not 157 features. 3 is the best. That's the ideal. And they should support the key message. So again, I get my notebook and I jot down What is it I want people to remember? And so if I think about what I'm doing for this session, I want you to remember that communication is really important to your success, and that the Oren framework will really help you, and that storytelling will really help you. That's all I really want you to remember, because if you remember that, then you might take some action and you might get better at doing something. So get clarity on what you want people to remember. Now, step on to the next one. Emotion. Let me put this quote up. This is a brilliant quote. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did. But people will never forget how you made them feel. I don't think there's many people in tech that when they're considering what they're going to pop in their presentation, think about how they're going to make the audience feel. They think about the architectural diagrams, the logic, the rationale, but they don't think about how you're going to make them feel. You're going to make them feel bored, overwhelmed. What is it you're going for? And I put it to you, and we're going to dig into this later, actually, that it's really important that not only have you got a great logical set of facts and rationale that you're out there laying out, but actually you connect to people and make an emotional connection. And because quite often we're so bad at it in tech, that's why I call that out specifically. So I start to jot down, what are the stories, the examples, the disasters, the things that have happened that I can use to bring this topic to life. And then the final thing I jot down are the next steps. So what do I want to happen next? And I'd be really intentional on what I want to happen next, because the presentation is never the end, right? The presentation is, we meet with these people, I present some facts, a decision is made, some steps are taken, we drive towards whatever success is, a customer using our product really well, or a product where we can take features to market really quickly, or whatever it might be. But what are the next steps? The presentation is not the end. So what are those next steps? So that's it. The Oren framework. A for audience, O for objective, R for remembered, E for emotion, N for next steps. And don't worry, I'll give you a place where you can download all of this stuff at the end, so that you can take this away with you as well. So that's the presentation. That's what I use to prep for presentations, and it is brilliant if you're coaching people in your team on how to communicate more effectively. And what I'm going to share with you at the end is a pack that you can download with loads of coaching questions and a template that you can use, so that if you need to coach people in your team to complete this really well, you can take that away and you can use it. So that's Oren. The second thing I want to talk about is storytelling. Okay, storytelling is a really good way to help make an emotional connection with people. But what do I mean by that? Let me pop this up. This is from Aristotle. This is called the 3 means of persuasion. And thousands of years ago, what he said was that if you want to persuade somebody effectively, you need to have credibility. You need to come across as credible. You need to have a great rational argument. I'm going to skip to that end one. You need a great rational argument. And you need to make an emotional connection to people. And if you get those 3 things right, you will be highly persuasive. And if you don't, you will not be as persuasive and not be as influential. And if I take those 3 and I set them in the tech world, I think we're a little bit out of balance. I think we over-index on logic and fact and rationale. We got great credibility, staff engineers, principal engineers, years of learning, loads of great experience. And we are light on that emotional connection. That's what I find that we often are. And we get it a bit wrong. And the thing is, modern neuroscience backs up what Aristotle was talking about. And there's a number of studies. This is a very simplified version of those studies. But basically, if you can get the amygdala, which is this part of the brain just above your spine, firing, as well as the hippocampus, which is more your rational thought, which sadly for me is the shiny, bold part at the front of my head. But if I can get that firing all at once, or I can get other people to get that firing all at once, what that means is they're better at problem solving. If you can light up the whole brain at once, as opposed to just part of it, people remember you better. People's cognitive processing goes up higher. They can problem solve better, and they are thinking better. So by you doing not only logic and rationale, but also emotion and making a connection with them, that gets them to think better, and they're going to remember you, and they're going to be able to problem solve better while they're with you, which are all really good things. So Aristotle, neuroscience has proven right. Now, I was chatting to a chap who came on one of my technical storytelling courses a few years ago now, actually. And his job was to get the engineering team to use the guardrails so that they were creating code effectively within guardrails safely. And he was in charge of change control and making sure that they followed all of those kind of change control policies and processes. And he said this to me when I started talking to him about storytelling. He said, "Look, Ben, I'm not that guy down the pub with all the stories." And I said to him, "Okay, trust me on this. Have you got any examples of where change control went really wrong?" And he thought, and he was like, "I haven't really got any." And then he went, "But we have just had that CrowdStrike outage. I don't know if you remember that CrowdStrike outage a couple of years ago now, took out a lot of Windows machines." And he basically said, what about if I tell that story, but if we tell it in the context of the bloke that pushed the button, that rolled out the patch, however it happened, that took down all these servers and computers throughout the world. And he told that story and started telling that story and weaving that in to the processes that he needed the teams to follow. And the level of interest rocketed. The impact he had rocketed, because it wasn't a boring set of steps and processes. It was brought to life by the impact that they had on people and the impact that they had on society. And it made a massive difference. So even if you don't feel you're a great storyteller, you can still have a massive impact. So what I want to give you is just a few real quick tips on if you're going to tell an anecdote, a story. A disaster story is often a really good one to tell. How you do it really well. Well, the first thing is you pick a relevant story. Something like CrowdStrike, really relevant to change control, for example. You pick a relevant story. You make it short. 1 minute, 2 minutes max. We haven't got time for Lord of the Rings, a 3.5 hour commentary. So keep it short. Make it about people. People care about the impact of the story on people. Give it a bit of structure, and I'll come back on that in a second. Make it an interesting story. A story about the world's IT being taken out is a lot more interesting than a story about burning your toast, for example. And also stretch the emotions. So if things were bad, make them terrible. If things were good, make them great. Don't lie, but use a bit of artistic creativity to make it a bit more interesting. And a lovely way to structure these stories is you do the anecdote, the beginning, you set it up. Who we talking about? When was it? Where was it? Meat and potatoes in the middle. What's the action that happened? And then don't forget to put a resolution on. And this is what happened at the end. Things got worse. It was a disaster. Things got better. It was brilliant. So a bit of a whistle-stop tour there on how you can tell more interesting examples, case studies, anecdotes, things that can go in that add human interest and emotional connection to the logic and the rationale that you've also got, nailed as well. And like Aristotle said, if you put all that together, that's when you're going to be highly persuasive and when you're going to be highly influential. Now, I'm running out of time. So what I just want to tell you about is coaching your team. So if you need to coach other people and you're a mentor and you think this would be useful, what I've created specifically for tonight is a little pack. Don't worry, you shouldn't be able to read this. But what there is, the first 2 pages you might be able to see are more dense with text. they are a load of coaching questions. So if you're trying to talk to somebody to help them understand who's going to be in the audience and build some empathy with who's in the audience and think about how to be relevant to some of their stakeholders, there's some coaching questions that help you get into that. So for all 5 elements of Auron, there's a load of coaching questions. And also there's then a template you could print out perhaps, and they could either write it and fill out the template on paper, or they could complete it digitally, whatever works for you. But all of that's available for you. So if you want to do that and you want all those coaching questions, now's the time. Get your QR code out. That's a little landing page I've done just for tonight where you can just download that pack from. So download the Auron coaching pack, and you can take that away and either self-coach yourself or use it to coach your team. And it works. So, for example, I was working with a data engineering team, and I went in and did my technical storytelling program with the whole team. And then the leader went, actually, what I've heard from the team is that would really help me. And so then I spent some time coaching the leader as well. The point being that this is really useful, whether you're in a leadership role or your team need to get better at communicating. It's really useful for both scenarios. So with that said, Ethan, are there any questions? I'll leave the QR code up so people can find it. And just before we hand over to the next speaker, are there any questions that have come in at all?
Yes, so we've got one chat in the chat who's put, hi Ben, can you please explain a little more of what does AI skills mean and consist of?
God, well, I mean, that is a great question. The point I was making there is probably more and more AI needs to become integrated into your tool chain, into your everyday business. So, if I think about it for me, probably I've now got to a point where most things I do, AI is making me faster, better, and really helping me out, more efficient. So now that is a really important part of my business. But it is not all of my business, right? I still need to be able to get on community events like this and speak to people as a human. So whilst I do need to go, AI is awesome, it's going to help me run my business better. And probably whether you're a developer, you're in DevOps, whatever you are, there are AI components that should be part of your tool chain that will make your team better. They are not the only thing you need. You still need great technical skills and you need great human skills. So I will leave the detail of what those AI skills are to other people, depending on the roles they're talking about and the technology they're talking about. Nice.
Awesome. Has anybody else got any other questions? I don't think we've had any extra ones come through. We'll just give it 30 seconds. So, oh, there we go. We've got one come in. So, take into account one needs to prepare for specific audiences. Do you suggest to prepare different presentations for different people and different levels?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So you could imagine there's a new solution. So let's say I'm working in a team, in an internal team, and there's a new way that we could do things, right? The way that I would talk about that to somebody that needs to sign off the business, sign off the funding, that needs to understand why it's important, the business outcomes it would drive. So if I was talking to a senior leader, I would need to be talking about why it's important, what it is, and how it's going to help the business. Now, if I'm talking about that to the people that are actually going to implement it and execute it, the conversations that I need to talk about with them and the way I present to them, there's going to be a bit of what it is and why it's important. Don't get me wrong, but there's going to be a lot of how are we going to do it? How are we going to execute it? What are the things that we need to do? What components make it up? How do we configure it? So what you wouldn't want to do is give all of that detail to a senior leader. They don't care. They just want to know why it's important and have confidence that you can do it or your team can do it. But you need to give some substance to the people that are really going to execute on it. So there's just one example where it's the same solution, two very different audiences, and therefore you need to build your message appropriately, because if you gave the wrong one to the wrong group, the impact would be minimal and your effectiveness would be minimal. So hopefully that helps. Gives a good example.
That's awesome. Perfect. Well, thanks very much for coming this evening, Ben. We do appreciate it. And in the past, I'm sure quite a few people watching may have been through it. We collaborated on a community speaker course, which has been extremely popular. So it's been fantastic to hear more about it. And I'll definitely send this session to a few more people in the community as well. So perfect. And yet we've had a response from that question. So great presentation. So it's lovely to hear. Perfect. Well, we're going to move on to our next speaker of the evening, David Sandilands. So thank you very much, Ben. I will bring David onto the stage now.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, I'm David Sandilands. My presentation is going to focus on how our delivery is evolving. We're kind of going from deterministic code, where we're kind of very sure about what we're delivering. We've all experienced can be very unpredictable. We have these moments where we've seen the kind of disastrous chatbots go out that abuse people in public, or we've also seen the reality, which is kind of we get reports around 90% of AI projects are currently not reaching production. But what I believe is, if we look at the evolution of delivery in DevOps and look at the past lessons we've learned and apply them to today, we can actually see that applying what we've learned and looking at today's problems, we can actually find it's just an evolution. It's not a complete change and revolution. So for today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, why I'm talking about this kind of thing, the historic stages of DevOps as I see them, the current AI stage of DevOps, and the kind of lessons and conclusions we should take from this journey. So yeah, I've been working for over 20 years. I started out in the Royal Bank of Scotland as a support infrastructure person, doing very traditional, completely manual work. I moved into Sky, where I learned about configuration management. I then came back to what was renamed the NatWest Group by that point, which kind of started to implement into the more abstracted era that we'll talk about, where you kind of got this digital transformation even from the most traditional organizations. Having gone through a lot of this, I moved on to Puppet, where I had several hats as a solutions architect, helping customers scale and understand their DevOps journey, as a product manager for the developer experience, and as a community lead for the open source part of Puppet. I've then kind of moved on to LaunchDarkly, where now outside of the infrastructure side, I'm working in that kind of code delivery area in terms of understanding flags, experimentation, and of course, like we're all doing nowadays, AI. And I had my own publications in terms of Puppet 8 for DevOps engineers, and I worked on the 2024 State of DevOps report. So I always kind of see this first stage in terms of exactly as I was describing my first job at RBS, where you had this kind of very manual era, where you had, if you've read the Phoenix Project, Brent was the main person who could get everything done. You had this kind of key person risk, where tribal knowledge on how everything worked created kind of major financial risks and also huge stress within teams. Nobody wanted to be the Brent who had everyone relying on him and everything having to go through him when things got serious. We also ended up with snowflakes as a result of this kind of tribal knowledge, because every combination of infrastructure and code kind of ended up uniquely handcrafted. In my own job, I as a support person, I used to sign off servers going live to production, and I could immediately tell who had actually built that server just from the little features you would see in terms of how it was made. And we kind of saw this kind of high error rates, difficult handoffs, and people defending the kind of limited views of their landscape, because you had support teams, you had developer teams, and they had very different motivations. For me as a support person, I just wanted to kind of keep things out because new things cause problems, and developers just kind of want to get things in with their set out project timescales. But the kind of DevOps developments in that first part, which were widely reported, in the very first State of DevOps report going back to 2013, was most organizations, really focused on standardizing hardware, standardizing on, specific OSs, particularly Linux, creating these DevOps teams where developers and operations work together rather than arm wrestled. And we saw the introduction of, standardized version control and peer review to create a culture of shared responsibility to develop and understand code together. We then kind of moved into this declarative era, which was kind of this wild west of cloud. The issue of coming out that first era was, we saw people kind of script more, but that kind of relied on a starting point, and trying to code for every scenario was just too complex. We saw a huge maintenance debt getting built up. All these kind of, whether it was kind of bash scripts, PowerShell, Python, whatever it was, this just created a huge maintenance debt, which was also often highly customized to key individuals who created them. And we saw, this huge expansion of virtualization and cloud. And it just made it so much harder to try and maintain everything. In that first era, I still have a book in my drawer from my graduate training that told me the Royal Bank of Scotland had 200 Unix servers, which seems like a lot at the time. But when you consider the thousands and thousands and thousands of virtual machines and cloud components that can be created and destroyed within the blink of an eye, the scale just went out of control. So, we turned to configuration management. We declared how we needed things, and we used that kind of code to maintain them by abstracting away, from our simple kind of step-by-step code. We then had more continuous integration. We built and automated the test and release process, and we moved to far more flexible infrastructure. We instead of these kind of fixed capital data centers, we moved to the flexible capacity in the public cloud. And one of the most interesting things I think here is when we kind of talk about AI having this huge challenge in terms of how it's so different and how people are worried about the jobs being eliminated by how different it is. I had the exact same situations with configuration management because people were used to how their old scripts ran, and they saw the level of automation that configuration management could make compared to simple step-by-step procedural scripts. And their concern was that, these scripts were just brought in to replace them. And, ultimately, it would also mask how things were done and understanding would be lost. But we quickly realized that through each of these evolutions, we keep abstracting away and we build our understanding, by using kind of continuous integration and testing to ensure we're doing the right things. But as we continue to abstract, and I think every CNF cloud native landscape is never meant to be in a picture anyone can actually read. We started to just find this explosion of tools, and it became too great. And all these DevOps teams who were essentially having to pick out their own sets of tools, work out their own chains, were finding they had this huge cognitive load, and too much time was being spent maintaining their own environments. And we kind of hit these kind of velocity limits because, the CI/CD pipelines could only go so far. Releasing to production has its risks and slowed us down. And, we then ended up with what I commonly found was instead of getting down to the kind of minimal features you want to release, we kind of ended up with almost like bundles of things that we needed to release at points, just to match in with kind of governance, with what our pipelines were capable, and how much risk we were willing to take. So, and also in this kind of abstraction era, this OpEx instead of CapEx, so having operational expense instead of just, buying, data centers and hardware, while it was potentially much cheaper, by only using what we needed, we found that very, small mistakes could actually snowball. And I'm sure everyone in that era kind of saw a huge cloud bill come in unexpected. We also kind of experienced almost a desperation from leadership in terms of having this feeling their organization was not abstracting quickly enough. They knew they had to get to the public cloud. They knew they were struggling to adopt for a lot of particularly large organizations, particularly regulated ones. And they made this idea that, things had to be cloud first, and to force people instead of guiding them. And that, as we'll go on to discuss how this stage DevOps actually helped, created more issues and more inappropriate cloud projects than actually helped anyone adopt properly. Because the developments we kind of saw in this era were, we saw containers and serverless doing the ultimate step of standardizing by stripping down infrastructure to the absolute bare needs. We also saw the kind of separating of release from deployment. As we saw feature flags come in, we produced far greater control, and allowing us to be able to turn on and off features without having to feel we've kind of committed with a deployment. So that allowed us to shrink those releases right down and get down to pure features, and even just to be able to expose those features to appropriate sized audiences. And when I talked before about the cloud first initiatives trying to force people into the public cloud, what I think we were all desperate for at that stage was the kind of platform engineering we've talked so much about. To reduce the cognitive load on engineers who don't need to keep reinventing the wheel, but can follow that kind of autobahn, that golden path, and have that conversation, ideally with the product manager who is looking after your platform, about what they're needing. What is going to really serve them value in the public cloud? Because I feel like that stage of public cloud adoption was hampered by people struggling to translate what they had today into what they really needed in the future, and get over the kind of fears of how many things they had to choose, how they had to understand things like chargeback and monitoring, when in the old world they had very fixed costs and they knew exactly what they were getting and what they were buying. So that leads us into today, the probabilistic era, as I'm dubbing it. As I discussed at the very start, we no longer have this deterministic code. And we kind of have this feeling we're moving away from certainty about getting the same result each time. That it feels like a more seismic change than going from that kind of procedural code I mentioned to configuration management tools like Terraform or Puppet, because they felt predictable. If you put in the right inputs, you always felt like you would get the same result. And we're also seeing this kind of a risk of the return of the key people. I have this feeling in so many organizations, AI feels so different and so complicated. Many people are stepping back or even boycotting, to far larger scale, because we see people kind of dub AI as dangerous or, something we can't control or can't understand fully. And yeah, it leads to this. Well, that's great for maybe, for the kind of personal uses we'll all have, and for cutting edge organizations, but for the larger organizations, how do they make it so that they don't have to kind of feel like they spend a lot of money on experts and have this huge clash between their production needs and the realities of AI. And we also see an even greater economic volatility. So even further than that public cloud era of trying to understand OpEx costs, we can feel that as people are experimenting and trying various models, they can make very small changes, or even just trying out little things, but can find they can get huge consumption spikes, even more likely than before. And I feel like all these problems I just described, we can kind of look back through that journey I just took you through, because we need to kind of build the platform up for the AI era. A control plane is more important than ever. We need product-led platforms that act as a PM for the developer experience, that help standardize guardrails and reduce cognitive load, and allow the engineers to focus on the business purpose of what they're trying to do AI, and not worry about all the plumbing, be that kind of, the correct LLMs to use, the AI agents, MCPs, how they have to join everything up. We are needing platforms more than ever to give sensible options to people. And the decoupling of release, it's more important than ever because we do have to experiment with so many models. We want to kind of do light exposure to real users, maintaining that kind of instant kill switch that feature flags give you, and give you that safety of not slowing down, not grouping things together, but being able to very quickly experiment on very precise groups of users and groups of use cases, and make fast observations, and continuing down the line of continuous governance. So we need to shift from kind of the manual gatekeeping to more automated sensors. Now, we've been doing that through each step of this DevOps journey, but it feels, particularly around AI, people are kind of holding on again because there's a feeling of getting to production is, with AI, is more dangerous than people have experienced before. And for me, one of the big things of platform engineering is compliance is this continuous byproduct of the platform. By making good, safe, good guardrails, good choices for people, we allow people to have that kind of golden path, and we have the audibility baked in the pipeline. Not something we kind of add at the end as an afterthought. And kind of doubling down on change and audit. So as somebody who worked at a 300-year-old bank, obviously change and audit was a huge part of it. And I feel there's often this misinterpretation of change and audit as something that's in your way. For me, change and audit is one of the most critical parts we have to think about coming into any adoption of technology. There's often this viewpoint when you speak to organizations initially that change and audit actually have very hard rules that are completely unpassable as we see these technology evolutions, and we've seen it at each stage. When things like Puppet first came in, and they were able to kind of make corrective changes, there was these huge outcries of that can't happen outside of a change window. And in the same way, we're getting these questions about AI. If we can't define exactly what it does, then that can't be a valid change. But change and audit are rarely clear must be done statements. They often require interpretation. If you look at various audit rules, such as PCI, these kind of big statements, they will have some elements, such as data centers must be so many miles apart for disaster recovery, but a lot of it is statements of intent, and that's where it becomes so critical to kind of engage your change and audit teams, because they all have good motivations and want to work with you. If you can explain what you're trying to do and how you're going to handle, the risk and approach they expect, to understand how you're delivering change into production, how you'll monitor that change in production, and how you can back out any issues that appear. And starting to use these change and audit processes as soon as possible prevents any executive privileges masking underlying operational problems. Because we often see this, when you've got something as big as AI, you'll very quickly get to a stage where you'll have an executive leadership sponsor who will allow you to kind of skip through stages because delivering the project is too important. And that allows you to get lazy, and it allows you to kind of get through a lot of problems and then maybe even get to production. Maybe you're part of that 10%. But then it gets to a scalability problem, because if we haven't considered these things, then we end up with platform teams who have to do lots of manual work to kind of massage change and audit through at every stage. And one of the big things for me is observation is no longer optional. I love this quote from the observability engineering book about how monitoring is about the health of the system. Observability is about the health of the business and experience of the user. Because in the last generation, we've seen a lot of talk about observability, but I haven't actually seen a lot of it implemented. But we often just end up with kind of big Datadog implementations, big Splunk implementations, lots of dashboards, where in my old job, I would have been told, how are the Unix servers doing? And I pull up graphs and I say, probably look all right, but we don't really understand, how are the users experiencing their journey? How is the business feeling things? And that's the most critical part of managing AI risk, is that we have to have live observation and using again those feature flags we talked about to come in to make sure that we safely immediately manage where we see in our observability degradation of the user experience or business results. And business purpose. So we've got to understand what I have quite an aggressive headset that likes to turn itself off. We've got to understand what outcomes we're really trying to achieve from our AI projects. And I quote this book, Safely to Earth. It's got a great bit in it about one of the chaps who was working between IBM and NASA. And one of the things he wanted to do was he wanted to replace the tape machines with terminals so that instead of feeding things in, they could just type things out. It seemed the most obvious change to make. Like many of us who've experienced AI, it's just obvious that I need, Gemini, or I need Claude code or whatever it is to do my day-to-day job. But when he actually made this request into NASA, their response was, okay, great, what do we get out of it? And he hadn't prepared this for the meeting. So in fact, the engineering set next to him said, we'll save 20%. So the NASA guy said, that sounds great. I sign it off. You'll have 20% less resources now. And that's where we need to be clear what our success metrics are going to be, and that they're visible to all stakeholders, and that we're benchmarking where we are and our progress on a success plan so that we don't get cancelled, we don't get lost, and we're able to kind of keep everyone's morale up and understand where we're progressing, or where in fact we need to review how we're working. So I'm aware I'm probably a little bit over time, but just to kind of give my my key takeaways here, I feel like that DevOps journey, we need to double down on our DevOps principle. Maturity is cumulative, and we must build from a very strong foundation. So ensuring we're actually following everything we've learned over that time, that we have solid platform engineering, that we're helping everyone come on the journey, and truly working as DevOps teams, that we're convincing and evolving with change and audit. We've got to be building and developing these principles as we go, and learning as early as possible how we can actually work to avoid scaling issues when you become a standard and you have to follow all the production rules to letter. Observability is no longer optional. AI requires constant monitoring of user and business, and it's no longer good enough to do the old style monitoring and kind of react to issues we see. And probably the most important thing for me, for all, is we've got to have measurable aims. We must understand our current position, what we're going to achieve, and show the iterative progress we are making. Otherwise, once the AI buzz dies down, which it eventually will, we will find ourselves unable to defend the platforms we've made, and ultimately just kind of running things down, or with things that teams have to maintain at great pain to themselves. So at that point, any questions?
That's fantastic. Thank you very much, David. So let's see if anybody has any questions. We'll give it a few minutes. So whilst we're doing that, one question from me. What is your favorite LaunchDarkly feature?
Well, I'm a huge fan of combining guarded releases with experimentation, because I think often people have implemented feature flagging, I think, is a major part of how people develop today. But when you actually have that kind of live observability in with the guarded releases, so that as soon as one of your chosen metrics goes wrong, it can immediately roll back. So something like latency or error rate, that just provides such a a high production level. And then when you combine it with something like experimentation, you then have that safety net, but you can also kind of develop and answer questions much quicker. When you're not sure about what results you're actually going to get when you go live.
Nice. Awesome. Cool. Well, we've got some fantastic feedback in the comments. So very thought-provoking presentation, which is good to hear. And then also we've got a question from Harry. So how do you see this in practice at LaunchDarkly today?
Well, what we're seeing at LaunchDarkly in terms of, every organization's kind of got its has done its kind of I'll call it experimentation phase with AI, because I think we all needed enough time to kind of try out different use cases, work out what seems to provide value. But what we're seeing is now at a kind of leadership level, we kind of get the direction of, well, here's some of the tools that we're looking to standardize access on. We get clear messages. We're not telling you not to use other tools, but we want to kind of be able to share, have our MCP set up, share agents, and have the kind of right kind of centers of excellence, which I always feel is kind of one of the key parts of platform engineering, is having those centers of excellence where people come together and exchange what they found works for them, and decide on things that can be standard pathways. So we're still maturing that. I think everyone is, but I think making sure you're having those discussions and being very clear on what value it's driving, and ultimately sharing it across your org, because that's what I feel like LaunchDarkly has been really good at, in terms of really pulling it together and having the demonstrations and having exactly like these kind of sessions where you have enough time to explain and question.
Nice. Awesome. Perfect. Well, I've really not got any other questions. So thank you very much for coming this evening, David. And also, if you want to hear more about LaunchDarkly and other kind of areas, please go recommend that you check them out. David's also a very established speaker all over the community, including DevOps days, etc. So I'm sure if you type your name in on YouTube, there's lots of different sessions that come up. So, but yeah, thank you very much. And we'll go over to our next speaker, Jacob.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me, see my screen?
I'll add in your screen now. There we go. Perfect. I'll hand over to yourself.
All right. If it's all good, then I'll kick off. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Excited to give you a brief presentation about what we learned about building a data context layer. Essentially, at RIG, what we're doing is data is our bread and butter. We're helping AIs and humans kind of talk to their data platforms in a better, more efficient manner. So as a quick overview of what we're going to cover today, first of all, I'd kind of like to shape the problem that we have identified and kind of explain a little bit about the reasoning. Secondly, we'll talk about what a context layer is to begin with. Like, what does that mean? How should you think about that? Then three, like, how do you build it in general? So hopefully this is a talk where we can tell you a little bit about, like the general concept, but also like what are some of the tactical tips and tricks. So we'll talk about closing the loop, like what did we learn, how to improve it, how to do better, and some open questions in terms of like things where we have a strong engineering view, and then things where we don't have a strong engineering view. And then finally kind of wrap up with some Q&A at the end. So hopefully it's meant to be kind of a useful session for you guys. Obviously at RIG, we have our own data context layer that we're providing to other businesses, but this talk should be general and should really help you design your own and think about how, irrespective of who you end up going with, if it's a home-baked version or if it's the one with us, it should give you some ways of like, how do I think about a context layer and how do I enable that? So what is a context layer really trying to solve? Without context, frequently the AI just becomes like an interrogator. So one issue that we frequently see, and I'm sure you guys have probably experienced it yourself, is whenever you're talking to an AI for the first time, you need to give it all this context, right? It's kind of annoying. Like you can ask it something like, build me a pipeline health report for this quarter. And the first thing that the AI does is like, well, where is the pipeline data? And that becomes like a big, goose chase. Like, oh yeah, then you have to think like, okay, yeah, we had it in that table, and then it was moved because we did the redesign, and they're like, okay, like it's this one. Use opportunities, and then you can ask like, what defines pipeline health? And then you can say, well, I'll have to think about it, but I think last time Tom in sales mentioned it was like deals that are stuck and that haven't had activity in 14 days. And then, then the next AI asks you like, okay, what counts as activity? Emails, some notes, does that count? And you think, oh, well, I mean, I guess like emails count, notes probably shouldn't count because that's just something that we do, sometimes a few days later. So that's not really activity, and then you kind of like iterate through this process. And this is quite laborious, right? Whereas like a good coworker should probably already have all this context. So if you tell your data analyst like, hey, I want a health report on our pipeline, they're going to probably make a reasonable assumption about all of these. And so that's really the problem that the context layer is trying to solve, is basically have the AI act as a coworker, right? It's efficient. It understands the context of your business, of your database, of your IDs, of your fields, all of that, right? So we're trying to like unify that understanding the same way that a smart analyst would. So why is this a tricky problem? Well, because we have drift between the kind of what's happening, the code that's running in production, and the like final business level understanding, right? So in essence, like we can have some code running in production, and this code will, execute some SQL, some JavaScript, Python, whatever language of your choice, and that will actually execute on the actual production data and create like entries in our database or warehouse. Now, that code is obviously like, that's what kind of happens right now. Then there's the engineering understanding, right? Of like, what do engineers in our organization have in their heads? And they would like, okay, have some sort of imperfect understanding of what the code was at one point. Then there's the documentation, which is like, hopefully the engineers remember to update the documentation and hopefully it's up to date, but it's like another drift. And then there's the business level understanding of like, how do the business docs talk about it? How do people in business think about it? So that's like the effective context layer in the human sense, what it is right now. Obviously, you can see that there's already all these sources of error. And it actually is even worse than that, because if you think about it from the perspective of a fast-moving organization, there's all these changes that happen all the time. So let's imagine, for the time being, to take a page out of Ben's book. So imagine I'm Tom, and I'm just like, doing a cleanup of some database, of some processing code that basically transforms the data tables in our database. And I create a pull request, I raise it, merge it, it executes that day. And a few days later, I get a ping from Priya in marketing. And she's like, hey, by the way, Tom, I saw, you're managing this table. By the way, I stopped getting reports for this particular subsegment in marketing. Is it just me, or did I do something wrong? And you realize actually that's a consequence of something that you haven't thought about. So you fix it and you kind of create another PR. A few days later, you get a on-call from an SRE who is like, oh, by the way, like we were relying on this value being present, and now we're getting alerts. Can you fix that? So again, something that you need to escalate. A few days later, you might get a ping from Marcus from CS, who's like, oh, by the way, like we were using this for like our diagnostics, and now our ETL fails. And again, it's another thing where you haven't considered the next order consequence. And eventually, kind of goes to Raj, who finally like finds the underlying cause and harmonizes the behavior. So that is a horror story, but it's something that I think we've all seen in some shape or form. Hopefully not every PR, not every merge request is that dramatic, but there are real issues with how we're deploying code to production and ways in which we're not as reliable as and as thorough in reasoning about the next order consequences, right? And ideally, what would have liked to have happened in a context layer setting is, you create a PR, some smart AI looks at your context layer, looks at the PR, and says, like, by the way, we think this is going to affect these dashboards for these people. This might affect this business process for those people, and it might, create an issue with an AI prompt somewhere. And then you can discuss it, update the context layer, and push the PR all in one go. So that's kind of the desired state. So hopefully it's like reasonably clear that this is obviously much better. But how do we come up with a good context layer? What does that even look like? So that is a great question. And the context layer is on a high level composed of a few things. So code, some sort of processing code of like, how is this data transformed? Obviously, sample values of those data, of actual production tables, some business documents, that is usually to like align the understanding that a business person would have, or the way that your business analyst would speak about a particular metric or a particular cohort or any other definition, and obviously what that maps onto in the data warehouse. Metadata, so where does the data live, some sort of logs, some sort of usage, and then sample values and the distributions. So all of that together will form that context layer. And obviously, once you have that context layer, you should think about things like governance, who can access what, sandboxing, like how do we make sure that our AI agents don't go rogue? How do we version the context layer? How do we make sure that a business user can read about the context layer and like check their understanding, or even an engineer? And how do we make the context layer sort of self-aware or self-healing with human help? So these are all kind of open questions that we're going to get to in a second. And then obviously the way that we then use that context layer, if we're humans, we can use it through like chat. So it could be like an MCP in our favorite AI tool of choice, whether it's Claude Code, Codex, Copilot, whatever. Our AI tools would talk directly to that context layer, and our systems would talk to that context layer. That could be anything from an ETL to a workflow, to a Notion page, to an agent, to an alert. So all of that can kind of be integrated into that context layer. So obviously there's a lot that goes into the construction of that context layer. So we've gone over a few of these areas. And ultimately, what you want to have is kind of move beyond the static layer, semantic layer definition. So that's something that we've traditionally had. And obviously, like all of these kind of inputs keep changing all the time. So one of the things that is really important is that this is a continuous process. And for us, for example, we would, every 24 hours, we would go through the context layer updates, look at if in the sample values we're seeing any big changes, if we're seeing any big changes in the distributions, and if we're seeing any big changes in the business docs, and kind of harmonize everything. Because what can frequently happen is that, there's some minor change in how we're processing some input, and then the distribution of like nullable values, something like that, like changes completely. And then that's something ideally most data leaders would want to have flagged to them ahead of time. So we kind of continuously try to get an accurate context. So, in the kind of pre-AI world, or the kind of the modern data stack as it was known at one point, the core kind of component of this was kind of the static semantic layer, where some human or usually teams of humans would go to their database and define for a particular field, like these are all the things that we should have kind of modeled in our warehouse or database. And there was usually a multi-week, multi-month effort of like standardizing everything, explaining everything in one place, and kind of making it easy for the business users to then consume, because then it was explicitly modeled with some understanding that was valid, at least at that point in time. Now, obviously, in the AI world, we want to move faster, and we want our agents to be able to make kind of decisions by themselves. So the AI context layer kind of now lives as a layer that our agents or our coding tools can talk to directly. And then those agents and coding tools will get information from this context layer. And once that context layer is queried, you can have a sandbox where you can try some sample values, some sample queries. And once that query is constructed, you can actually query the warehouse. So you can then have like auditing and full run a full scan of sometimes very big tables, right? So you don't have to like check, your agent doesn't always have to check against BigQuery or Redshift or the big kind of warehouse. You can model all these attempts locally and then kind of push it out. So fundamentally, we kind of create this like context layer that it sits between the data warehouse and your AI coding tools or automations. We think this is like an interesting way to organize your coding system, because it kind of gives you these nice things like the sandboxing, the auditing, and the governance that we discussed. And ultimately, it is a much safer way than just giving Claude Code access to your warehouse. So what that enables us doing is essentially kind of help humans highlight all these issues. So for example, if you have like payment rates or any sort of deviations from what the norm is, the context layer can kind of flag it and help you kind of verify these issues. So as we're doing these nightly refreshes, we can say like, hey, by the way, there's a big change in the distribution of this value. Because it's modeled, we know it's important to you. Do you want to do something about this? This is something that you should be careful about. And then with the human engineer in the loop, you can kind of modify that process. So you can kind of now imagine like the usefulness and how you derive a context layer. What if you wanted to build one of your own? So your first idea might be, I want to build some sort of set of markdown files. That's very common. We've seen that in a few places where people would have like a whole bunch of markdown files, sometimes like even linked together, that would essentially create some sort of wiki. Now, the first thing that we'd advise is like, this drift is structural and accidental. Like this issue between kind of going from the production code to engineering understanding to docs to business, that drift happens everywhere all the time. And there's some fundamental irreducible context loss. So try to minimize that and try to have everything in one place so that you can modify the code and the documentation in one go. The second lesson that we've learned is that you should probably have more than just static docs, right? So these MD files, they're going to be a snapshot. Someone kind of writes them, maybe someone updates them from time to time, even using AI perhaps. But if they're just static files that are not refreshed at the same cadence, they will go out of date and they will cause you issues. And so that's why like every time someone makes a change within our context layers, we propagate that change to the kind of next order effect. So if there's tables that are affected by a particular change, we make sure to like re-inject that context. The third lesson was kind of having a context database is extremely useful. We've seen people kind of put massive markdown files into their GitHub, and that could work for small teams or small startups. But even for them, it gets messy very quickly. And there's constant updates to those files. You don't know if that's live. Like, I understand that the desire for Git versioning is strong, but at the end of the day, having a versioning in a database is much better, and you always can be sure that you get the latest version. And then the governance and sandboxing are extremely important. We've seen people run queries that are like hundreds of dollars worth accidentally because BigQuery makes you pay by byte scanned, and if you just give Claude Code your API keys to connect to BigQuery, your credentials, it will run those big queries. It will try to be sensible, especially if you tell it to. But we've seen so many instances in which AI agents have been running huge queries that have not been, that sometimes haven't been tested, haven't been sandboxed, sometimes haven't been, should be better audited. And all of that is something that you ideally want to think about when you're constructing your context layer, and really make those a first-class citizen. And then in terms of the behavior that we would we've learned about working with context layers to the humans, kind of moving more towards the organizational design. One thing that we would highlight to people is, don't just give the keys to an warehouse or database to your AI agents. Rather, give it to a context layer that can then intelligently manage what the agent has access to. It's much more consistent. It doesn't create all these problems. And for the humans at the other side of it is a much nicer experience, right? They connect to one centralized context layer and only then kind of talk to all their data sources. Having documents that are live and are inferred rather than authored by a particular person is extremely beneficial for fast-moving organizations, because they don't have to worry about what version was this looked at. Sometimes someone hasn't touched a particular document for ages. We're really trying to avoid that issue. So every time there's a change, if a distribution changes, that is reflected then in the docs that describe the context layer. The next lesson is more about awareness of the context layer. So you want a context layer that is self-aware, but not necessarily self-healing. We have found that data teams especially want to have a very tight control over what are the changes that get pushed out. So at Rig, what we do is we kind of flag issues to the data teams, but we would not directly push anything out. We would say by the way, we think you might want to look at that. And that usually becomes a start prompt for some of the data engineers to be okay, by the way, can you fix this in the next release? And you can just copy paste that into Claude Code or your tool of choice. But so ultimately, people want to have control. I don't think we're quite at the level where just having a fully self-healing context layer is feasible. Maybe some are braver than us, but I think it's still nice to have that level of control. And then the last lesson is the code and data hybrid reasoning. So for a lot of the bigger kind of transformation, you want to have context that understands the data that's being used. So yeah, you want to understand both the source of that data, but also the processing code. And usually that kind of yields the best results. We are kind of more in that spectrum. We're more data biased because we've worked for a couple of decades across the whole team in a very many situations. And in a lot of big enterprises, someone might have a way of processing a particular data set for a couple of months, then they change that couple of months later, and then the code, if just by looking at the code, you would never figure that out. So you need to have an understanding of what are the big releases and how they impact the actual data that appears in the distributions. So just kind of, I guess, wrapping up, fundamentally, we're big believers in driving action from context. The best starting point tends to be just figuring out what the search is. How do we, first of all, surface the right information from that context? Then how do we analyze that information? That could be semantic layer, that could be usage rules. And then thirdly, how do we act with that information? So we make a big point of using that context layer to push out information to Slack. Here's an alert of something new that happened, or a degradation in this metric. you can update, HubSpot, you update your CRM. All of these things can be part of that context layer so that it's kind of managed from a central location. So one example that might be relevant to some people on the call is, for example, dbt modeling. So for those of you who use dbt, the context layer that you can construct and can be a massive accelerant for actually updating your dbt docs. So sometimes you can say, like, use the context layer MCP. I want to update the dbt docs for this table, and it will then take the lineage, it'll take the history, it'll take the table grain, the join, and kind of apply it in one location. So if you're building a context layer, you wanna think about, like, okay, how do I actually use that context layer to also speed up my engineers? Because typically, they're excited about these new tools, but you kind of want to help them, like, how do I not just help the business side, but also how do I help the people actually writing the code? Just to kind of end my talk on some open questions. So there are a few things where you might want to challenge us perhaps, and this is something that we're kind of fully transparent about. For example, is the versioning that context layer should have better in a database, or kind of with some Git kind of sprinkling on top? Like, is there a better way to manage the context files and the context layer within Git itself? Because obviously that gives you nice diffs. That could be useful, but we found that it's much easier to just kind of keep it in a database, and kind of, rather than having all these constant reads and writes as the data changes. The code integration. So at the moment, we're very data centric. So we look at very heavily what the data is, what's the distribution. We don't always try to reason from the code itself, from the ETL code or other processing code, what the sample of possible values is. We could do that, but we found typically better to just look at the data. And maybe there's like a better hybrid approach where you can actually get the best of both worlds. Third is kind of like, what are the bottlenecks that slow down teams throughout the organization and moving faster with their AI tools? So context is certainly helpful for a lot of data analysts, data engineers, but is it sufficient? There's other bottlenecks that happen very frequently, especially in large orgs, and we want to make sure that the context layer serves the business users, the technical users, but also the organization as a whole. And then the self-healing element. I think some people, I think especially in like the YC Silicon Valley types, love to like go all in and kind of let their agents autonomously rip on their code bases. You can do that in theory. I think we're like a little concerned about like the lack of control that the human might have, because you're kind of constantly changing the ground from underneath you. But it is, these systems are getting pretty good. So maybe at one point it will be feasible. And then of course, like the alerting mechanisms, like what's a good way to not overwhelm humans, but at the same time, like give them an interesting enough of an interface to like give them a broad sense of like the types of changes that are happening every day within their context layer. So with that said, I'd love to open up to the questions. I'll leave you with the idea that like context is not just documentation. It is like at this point part of your infrastructure, because it will go into your prompt, it will go into your AI coding tools. So you definitely want something that's live, something that's observable, something that's governed, and something that understands both in the code and the data. So that's it for me. Any questions? Oh, I can't hear you if you're saying anything. So it might be on mute. Is that possible?
Apologies, my microphone's on mute. I do apologize. Can you hear me now?
Okay.
Perfect.
Yes.
No,
Yes.
So I've got like a microphone on and a microphone off on my actual microphone, and then digitally as well. So it's fine. I should have looked down. Yeah. So we'll just give it a minute or so, just see if any questions come through. But in the meantime, question from me. So what's been your favorite kind of AI advancement that you've seen over the past few years?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously like a big change for I guess many of us has been Cloud Code, right? Like Cloud Code has been a huge accelerant. I think it's interesting because a lot of like, I don't know if you guys saw, but the Cloud Code kind of code, the code of the actual tool, including all the harnesses and and I think most of the prompts has leaked. So it is still available on the internet if you search hard enough for it. It's interesting, right? Because like ultimately, like the model itself is insanely powerful, but the harness really makes a huge difference. Like I've I think I had this similar journey to most people. Like started with VS Code, eventually switched to Cursor, then to Cloud Code. I think that's pretty common these days, but I think it's been like a hugely interesting looking at what the key differences between Cloud Code and for example, Cursor uses the same model, right? Ultimately, they both use Anthropic's models or can use Anthropic's models. And so, I think just in terms of like the raw speed up to my coding, it's definitely been Cloud Code. And yeah, I think, it's even better with a nice context layer. So whether that's your own or rigs, like I think it does make a big difference, especially if you're doing like data heavy work.
Nice. Awesome. Cool. Well, I'm afraid we don't have any other questions. So thank you very much for speaking this evening. Thank you everybody who's joined on the call. We've had people drop in and out. So for those who are remaining, thank you very much. If you go on our meetup page, you can see all the rest of our meetups. The full program will be going live at the end of this week. For those also based in Leeds, we've got our Northern DevOps and Platform Conference on May the 19th. Our speakers are going live on Wednesday. So if you're interested and you're based in Leeds or prepared to travel to Leeds, I would highly recommend you check out that conference. There's lots of awesome other stuff going on involved in the community. So make sure to follow me on LinkedIn as well as Community Stack's LinkedIn page. So that's enough from me this evening. I would like to thank all of our speakers, including David. I'll bring him back on the call. So thank you very much. I hope you all have a lovely evening and we will see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.